Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well today. I see Nico's here, and I'm guessing that Quindy is, and probably some other people. Happy Monday. Hope you're enjoying your Monday. Hope you can hear me and see me and all that good stuff. Trying to, hi, Beguiler, find the right settings and everything. I've moved the desk camera around a little bit because I noticed I was scanning through last week's episode and I was going out of frame a little more than I realized. So we'll see if that helps. I'm going to switch over to that now. And then possibly I have to adjust the camera. Nope, I think I had hit it while I was shaking my paints, but it looks like I didn't put it too askew. So just we'll give people a few more minutes to come and I will kind of recap some stuff. So these are the paints in the Kickstarter. Oh, I did it in the wrong order. So this is the painter's picks. And so these are all paints that are currently available. You can see that two of them are metallics. I forgot to show how shimmery they were last week, so I'm going to make sure to do that. So you can buy any of these individually already, but you can get them for a really good price as a pack in the Kickstarter, which the Pledge Manager is now open, is my understanding. And then these are the new paints that we designed for the Kickstarter, which I continually forget the name of what that pack is, but it's something like Bone 6 Kickstarter paints. It'll be obvious. Lino One Hat. My brain is sort of melting as it's hot here in Western Canada. It looks like we may get more rain. Yeah, I feel you, Lino. I from Canada, from Toronto, not from the western part, and I live in Tennessee now, and we get some heat. But then it seems like everybody gets some heat now. So I will say the one thing about living somewhere where there was always heat is there's a lot more air conditioning than I was used to being able to have access to in Canada. Like, I mean, I knew people who didn't have air conditioning in their car, which that's not a thing that happens as much here. So these are the paints, and I do not remember the number of the episode, but if you go back on YouTube a few episodes, I did a show where I swatched these ones and talked about ways you can use them, and a show where I swatched these ones and talked about ways you can use them, and there's also information on how you would use those colors in the Pledge Manager. So that's that, and now I realize that I forgot something, so hold on just a sec. Where'd he go? I forgot our mini of the month, Lars Ragnarsson. And some of the stuff that I thought about when painting him, which relates to using color schemes, but painting somewhat neutral colors, so browns and tans and blacks and ivories and so on, gray. Some of that is going to apply to what I talk about today with the Snake Man, the Nagendra from last week that we're going to critique and see if we can make his cousin look a little better. Or address some of the critiques would be a better way to put that, I guess. Currently on my blog, the latest post that I put up, which seems like it's pretty popular, is talking about that. It's talking about how to see color in colors like brown. You know, let's get is this brown, orange, yellow, red based? That's really hard to tell. I mean, I'm still not amazing at detecting that. So the blog post has some tips on how you can see that. And then the value of using colors, I mean, it applies more to grays and stuff when you're talking about color with coloring, or neutrals with coloring. But and I've talked about this here on the show, how I think that, you know, a gray like this is kind of a brown gray, or a gray with just a little touch of brown, is a more natural color to use for like stone and fur and stuff like that. So if you're tired of me always talking about that on this show, but not really getting into detail about, well, what do I mean by a little bit of color and how do you make that work with, you know, say you want to use a color scheme and you want to use the triad of like red, blue, yellow. How do you make that work with a gritty warrior or a skulking thief, someone who's not going to be wearing, you know, bright red, rich blue, you know, really vivid yellow. So that's what my current blog post is about. That was inspired by my experience of painting Lars. So I'm working on one now where I talk about specifically how I apply that to Lars, how I found the color scheme, and how I figured out paints. So let's see if I can fit the colors, because I dialed it up before I started the show. Oops, going closer instead of further away. So it's if you look at him, it's not going to be obvious that the color scheme is red violet, red orange, yellow green, and blue green. You can probably spot the blue green and the yellow green. The blue is on his axe. The green is on his kilt. I've been calling it a kilt because I don't know what else to call it. One day I will ask somebody to sit down and teach me the names of articles of clothing and armor. But probably not anytime soon, because I figure that's part of the entertainment of watching this is me getting everything wrong. But it's less obvious that the orange, I mean, it's his skin is one part of it. And then also the smaller leather pieces are an orange brown. And the red violet is the rest of the leather. It's the leather armor. So if you look at that, you're probably not thinking red violet, but it's a very neutralized version of red violet. And that's how you can still use one of those color schemes and then apply it. Kirinico suggests loincloth, and I thought about that, but I don't know, I went back and forth, because it covers a lot more of his butt than a loincloth. I think it's just a kilt with a lot of splits to show off his fine gams, or it got ripped up. I don't know. Lino One Hat. It's most specifically hot in Alberta. Also, I have a lot of nicknames because people struggle over my username. Feel free to call me Lino or even One Hat. Okay, I probably will do that. I think we have another person that has a hat. But anyway, getting distracted, as I often do. So look out for that. But if you want to have some information on how to paint better browns and blacks and grays, you can head to the blog right now. And that is what is there. So I'm going to put him somewhere safe. Do I have somewhere safe? Because I got my clipboard back, and I want to acknowledge the fact that it is precariously perched and could fall down. So I don't want it to fall on a finished miniature. So I think that's kind of all the catching up. Well, I will just show the snakeman before I get the crummy thing. So last week I finished up this figure. So using a lot of the techniques that I cover in the Learn to Paint kits, we did side brushing instead of dry brushing on the metal, but that's not really a huge difference. It's very similar to, dude does have some beefy thighs, I agree. He does not skip leg day or arm day. He doesn't skip any of the days because he's got the abs working too. So he's all about the core as well. So I'm going to, since contest season is here, and some of the people watching or watching later may be preparing to come to the MSP Open or maybe the Gen Con painting contests, or there's a lot of other contests, things online. I'm going to sometimes talk specifically about the MSP Open because that's the contest that I help judge at and I know the most about. But when I'm talking about improving your miniatures, it doesn't even have to be for a contest. Maybe you want to paint one of these as the captain and he gets a little more special attention because he's going to be the guy with the most hit points. It takes him the longest to hit, so he's going to be on the table the longest. Maybe you want to paint something for a friend. Maybe you don't even want to improve at all, which is fine. But for those who do, I want to give some of the critique points that you might hear in feedback at the MSP Open, or possibly from people you take painting classes with, other contexts like that. And again, give you an example of what it looks like to put that into play. Because I think for a lot of us, we don't visualize very well. I know we probably have some people out there with aphantasia. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's, you can't form pictures in your mind very well. And I actually have that to a mild degree. It has improved doing art, but I've never been one of these people that says, well, I have this vision for my miniature and I know what it's going to look like at the end, or I know how I want it to look like at the end. Nope, it's a surprise to me the whole way through. I may have ideas about, okay, here's a color scheme I want to use here. I know the paints, but I don't know how it's going to actually look when it all comes together. Hey, Valander. So I'm going to give a critique of this guy, and then we're going to paint his cousin, addressing some of the points that I made. So I painted the bodies of the two of them the same, and I actually had originally done the belly scales, but I painted over this guy's belly scales for reasons that I will get into soon. So let's give a critique of this guy. But I know that the image quality isn't like amazing, so I'm going to look at the photograph of the figure while, hold on, I gotta pause something here. So that was actually nope, now this guy's here. All right, I'm excellent at this. Hold on. We'll get back to the Lars, because while we're here, I might as well show you pictures of Lars. Maybe you can see some of the colors I was talking about a little better here, because I think the color reproduction on the photograph is going to be better than my desk camera. So this is the figure of the month at Reaper. You can just go buy one, but he's also available as a gift with purchase. I think the minimum purchase is $40 US or equivalent currency. But now let's talk about our Snake Man. So we'll start here in the front view. That's the back. Let me just switch my thing. I think the back view will be most useful to look at for a couple of things. And then I wanted to do like the shield is pretty cool. I wanted to do a shield view. So let's kind of start with the overall thing. So, and when I do the revisions, I'm going to try not to get much more advanced in technique. I'm going to assume that, okay, this is your level, but these are things you could have done a bit differently that are within your skill set. So I'm trying to address different skill sets as I talk about the critique things. So this is someone who'd be like at least solid level bronze, maybe, high bronze, trying to push to silver, we'll say. In the MSP Open, every contest does their thing differently, and I'm only a judge there. I have judged other contests in the past, but I'm currently only a judge there. So in terms of judging stuff, I'm only going to comment on that one. Anyway, so the color scheme is like solid. The different areas of the figure are legible. You can tell kind of basically who he is and what he is, even from arm's length view, which I will show again after I go off the images. But it doesn't hurt anything, but there are ways we could tweak the colors just a little that would help things. So that's one big thing I want to look at is the color choices. It's useful to do that in advance. Like I was talking about how I chose the colors for Lars in advance, and I'm going to show an example of that in my next blog post. I don't always do that in the real world, so sometimes we edit later, and I'm, that would be the case with this figure if I was trying to, spruce up the same one. That's why I had to do the sprucing. I would also say that this is a Bones figure. This is an original Bones, Bendy Bones. There is a limit to how good I could make this figure. Like even how good that I could look if I busted out all my skills. There's a limit. I could disguise a bunch of stuff. I could do what we call paint plastic surgery, but there's a limit. So if I were painting this for a highly competitive contest, I would want to get a metal copy if one was available, and I believe that one is. One thing that I did not address in this at all is prep and mold lines. So the Greymaster says the sword's a bit messed up, and it is. The runes, I don't think, show up quite as well as they would on a metal copy. I do think it doesn't look like as bendy as some of the thinner weapons can look on classic Bones. So it's in pretty good shape that way. You're not gonna like be walking past a shelf and go, oh, look at that guy's sword way bent out of shape. You're gonna have to look a little closer to see that, oh, those runes aren't very crisp. But the detail on the shield actually came through really well, and the detail on the scales and stuff. So it's a great figure. It's just if you're painting a contest entry, your canvas is part of it. So that is something to consider, especially if you're gonna, you put a lot more time into a contest entry. If you're someone who does, like, if this is just like your best guy that you've painted for your game and you want to put him into the MSP Open, it is that kind of contest. We want to see him. We are not expecting you to put in this huge Herculean effort if you don't want to. This is for people who want to. If you're looking to improve, having the crispest, best casting, nicely sculpted figure that you can gives you an advantage because everything you're putting on it is on top of that. So that's a solid foundation. That's like building your house on a solid foundation. And your color scheme in a similar way is a foundation that you want to build on. But as I was saying before I got a little distracted, there are visible mold lines on this figure. I'm not sure if you can see them in that photo. Let's see what the next angle is. Nope, you definitely can't see them at that angle. Let's go to the back. Maybe it's there. No, I'll show them to you live. There's also, you can kind of just see it where it curves down to what would be his butt if we were a human. There's, it's glued together. It's a two-piece figure, and there's a join there that's a little more obvious. Now, if you were entering this in painters at the MSP Open, the bulk of what is considered is painting. So stuff like prep and assembly and all of that, creativity, those are a factor. Like the various components of that break down to about 30% of your score. But it's not going to be like you're dinged and doomed to not get anything near what your painting is worth because you missed a mold line. But it does reflect on the amount of care and attention that you give to the figure. This is kind of an agonizing figure in the sense of addressing mold lines on scales is not a joy. So it'd probably be easier to do that on a metal copy as well, because you can file and get in between, you know, the edges, the rims of the scales and file down and stuff like that. So let me go back to this view. I will just zoom out for a minute and show what I was talking about with the, you know, you can still tell who he is and, you know, what the major parts of his equipment are here. So the color scheme is like perfectly solid on that front. But is there something that I could have done to make the color scheme a little better? So I have one very strong color here, which is the orange, orangey red, however you want to look at it. So what goes with orange? So I put my color thing away too soon, because let's consult it and find out what goes with orange. All right, so we have orange up here. The first thing that goes with it is blue. That is the color complement of orange. Those two colors are as different as two colors can be. That's kind of, you're opposite each other on color wheel. That's what that means. This is a warm color. This is a cool color. And they call them complements because if you put them together or close by one another, each kind of excites your impression of the other. So they complement one each other. They work well together. You can make that too much. I mean, if they're both very highly saturated, sometimes you'll get like a pink and a green and it'll make your eyes melt. You can take it too far. But the overall idea is that color complements are very complementary to one another. The other option I would look at is a triad. You know, this is a fairly simple figure. It probably doesn't need more than 3 colors, and then, you know, some neutral stuff like the metal or whatever. So orange, violet, green. So as it happens, we have green on this figure. So all I would need to do to bring it into line with the triad scheme is add purple. I wouldn't have to add purple directly on the figure in an obvious way. I could have used a dark purple to do the, because I use black for the wash on the metal. If I used a dark purple, then I'm working with my color scheme, and the purple is still there. It's still a part of the color scheme. You've fulfilled the triad, and the colors are enhancing each other. I thought where you have that green base, I would go purple to violet for that center brown. Yes, that would be another option, is to use, I put him away for safety, but, you know, this is a bit more of a purpley brown. So if I'd done something like that, let's kind of pretend, maybe put it against the orange there, that would accentuate stuff a little bit. So that is one option. I'm actually going to go with the complement. This character does not require a ton of colors to figure out what's happening, and complementary color schemes are very effective. So I want to do kind of a blue steel effect on the metal, and I think I'm going to do blue for the straps as well. I'm debating whether some of the straps should still be another color brown, because you know, I typically do like to have gear that I'm more likely to use one or two colors for gear than to be, I don't know, historically accurate is how some people would feel about it, where every single, you know, bag, pouch, belt, boots is a different brown. There are artistic reasons why that's not good, and if you paint miniatures to get on the table and you want them there quickly, there are certainly time reasons why that is not the best option. So I'm not going to do that. Oh yes, Gray Mouser was reminding me of where some of the problem areas in the prep are. So you can see that there's a join there. I think you can also see the mold line that goes like right here. It's not super obvious on camera. Sometimes these things are like more obvious on camera and sometimes they're less. There's another place where the mold line goes. And there you can see the join even more. So ideally for like a really top level contest entry, I would want to be filling that with putty and making it blend in as much as I can. And then I know there was a mold line on those belly scales, but I'm having trouble getting it to show up on camera. But it's way more obvious in person. And that's kind of, you know, when you're looking at the front view main angle of the figure and a mold line is really obvious, that is far from ideal for presentation purposes. Gray Mouser is generally against browns. Well, I don't hate all browns, but I do kind of like to tune them to the color. So when I'm talking about making this complementary, one thing I want to do is get rid of this green on the base. Why is this here? It doesn't have to be here. If I'm doing the green, purple, orange thing, then it makes sense why it's there. If I'm not doing that, it's the second most saturated color on the figure is going to draw attention. This is not the focused area of the figure. This is the focus area of the figure. Maybe his weapon is a secondary focus area. And then if you're talking about a diorama or something like that, then your focus area is the story. Or sometimes you might have a figure where, you know, whatever they're doing with their hand, maybe that you want to be the focus area. But it's good to think about that. What's the area you want people to look at first and spend the most time looking at? And then even if the idea of how do you emphasize a focal area and using contrast, even if all of that seems like artistic nonsense that you just are not in the frame of mind to deal with, think about not sabotaging yourself at least. So decisions like that, making this base, it's pretty light and it's a pretty, and I used a lower saturation green. I used meadow green, and then this was the highlight. I don't know what I did with meadow green. So it wasn't like I went in there with grass green, which that'll be something that you see people do sometimes because they paint all of their figures with the same base so that it matches their game table or whatever. And again, that's fine. We're perfectly happy if you want to bring in figures that you actually use and put them in the contest. We love to see them. But if we're talking about, you know, what am I doing from an artistic point of view to make this the best version of this figure that it can be, not putting bright green on the base that's going to distract you from looking at him is a good step. Putting bright green in his eyes would have been better. So I deliberately didn't do that. I just used the green that I had. But using a super saturated, if you have a very small area, using high contrast in all senses of the word, so it would be saturation in this case, and then also having that dark eye rim around something that's lighter, that helps people see the tiny bits. All right, so that's kind of the general color scheme change that I want to make on the figure. Let's talk about some areas of it specifically. So I did a wash and dry brushing on the scales. The wash did a really good job in this sculpt of bringing out the scale detail. Like you can see most of the scales, you get the impression of scales, you see that texture. What it doesn't do is bring out the form. So form is a word for 3D shape. So the basic 3D shape of this guy is a cylinder. You know, he's a snake, he's a tube. Like my paintbrush, he's just a curled up tube. And then we also have the shape of the shield is like a half moon. There's some minor, other shapes in there. And that's what we're trying to do with highlights and shading, with washes and dry brushing. We don't always talk about it that way, but we're trying to accent the forms of the miniatures, because when they're under natural lighting, like, you know, our lighting in scale to us, like you're looking at with a ceiling lamp or whatever, they're too small to cast the shadows and have the highlights that something that was life size would have. So we're painting that in to make them look more three-dimensional. So even though it's a three-dimensional object and you think you don't have to do that, they're so small that you do have to do that. And I can, spoiler alert, into what that would look like, because I painted this figure for RVE class. So this is one of the, like, I painted one, I think this is the guy, yeah, this is the guy I painted kind of as a test. I wanted to test my colors to see what to get people to, you know, I wanted to know my colors in advance so that people could have the same colors if they wanted. And then this is the one I actually painted in the class. So if you look at either of them, we'll look at the one I did in the class, you'll see that it looks lighter here and then way darker under where the tail folds under. And then it looks lighter on top here and then darker where the curve of the cylinder is sloping down towards the ground. I don't really have a lot of that here. I did do some of the highlighting with the dry brushing with that in mind, but I didn't do the extra step that I did on this figure in the class for the shading. And that extra step was to apply a few additional washes, or, I mean, really it's layering, but I'm trying to get it to sound less scary and call it like a targeted wash. So you're basically doing the same thing. You're just not applying it over the whole area. You're applying it in places where there should be more shadows. So that's, I'm going to do that with this guy. And that's one of those areas when I was talking about using purple on the metal. I could also use purple for that function. If you use complementary colors or other cool colors in your color scheme in shadow areas, it's usually not detectable to people's eyes, but it adds a level of depth and richness that just working in the same color family will not always do. So I'm going to start out in the same color family, and then we'll see if I feel like adding a little more with some of the blues that we're going to play with. Because I know it seems scary, but I think that to me, that's a pretty accessible way to start working with more color. Like if you ever watch Crow's Nest and you're watching Michael painting and he's got like magentas and bright greens and all this stuff on his palette, and he's working with all of that color at the same time, and he's all over the figure and it seems incomprehensible. This is not how I work. It's incomprehensible to me too. James Wappel is another person who works like that. I find it easier to kind of break things up, so I might have my value transitions where I'm working on the shadow should be darker here and the highlights should be lighter here, and then I can come back in and add color with thin down color. I use some color in my shading, but in a general way to make it more comprehensible, that is what I do. So, and then this is the same idea. I started with this color scheme, but then I realized it used more paints or it required more mixes or whatever, so I wanted to come up with a variation that I could just tell people simple things to get and simple things during the class. But this is kind of the exact same idea, just more of a yellow brown instead of an orange brown. So the idea of giving shape to the form is irrespective of color or what the shapes are. It's just, and again, form is just 3D shapes. So what I want to look at is think about this figure, and if the sun is coming from up here, or I can choose an angle even if I want, where would things look darker? Where would the sun be obscured from shining? Those are places I want to add more shadowing to. So a little bit here, a lot here, because if you look at that let's look at it from the other side, that is sloping way under. So the sun's how is it getting under there? It is not. Where it curves down towards the ground. I kind of want to do a little bit, if you look at his back, it's like the shoulder muscles protrude a little, and then it dips in towards the waist, it dips in towards the spine. And I think I did do that. You can see a little bit of shading here on that one. Now, ideally, I would have done this while I was doing the wash stage so that I could add a little of the texture detail if I wanted to some of the shadow areas. I didn't do that. Not going to worry about it. If I need to, I can come back and do a little more dry brushing. Under the neck is another place that would be darker, because you look at that, his head is poking out. The sun is not getting here. And those are the main places, I think. I mean, we could do under his arms a little. One of the advantages of trying this technique on a figure like this is all of that texture is going to hide if there are transition lines. I'm going to show you a thing you can do to avoid transition lines, but it really works well on textured pieces. So like fur, I like to have people practice on wolves. Those are good ones to begin with. Especially that, what is he called? Direwolf? Is he called Direwolf? There's like a big wolf, and he's in bones now. And he's a good one to practice this kind of thing with, I think. I'm just going to get my paint set up. Palette out. I do have to check it for water, though, so it's going to be in screen for a minute. Well, and let's also check it for wrinkles, which probably means I don't have quite enough water in there. It's hard to find the... I don't like to put too much water in when I'm streaming because I move this thing around, and sloshing would not be fun for any of us. Well, okay, it might be amusing for you guys, but it would not be fun for me. So I'm checking for little drops of water because those could mix in with my paint and then it wouldn't be the consistency I want. But now I remember that I told you I was doing a wash, so I don't even need this yet. Because doing washes on flat surfaces is messy. Use this. And I said I would start within the color families that I chose. So Ready Leather is the color that I used for the overall wash to bring out the scales. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to go a little darker again. And it is a wash, so I want it to be kind of transparent. If I'm concerned about controlling it, I can use a little medium, also known as brush on sealer in Reaperland. And that will make the paint mix feel a little less watery. Might make it a little easier to control. It will, if you're used to only thinning washes with water, it will feel weird to you. Like it'll feel a little weird when you're mixing it in on your brush. But the end effect is the same, if not better. If you have problems with wash rings, this stuff also helps with that. Helps break up the surface tension. So I do want this a little darker than my original wash because the point of this is to be adding shadows. So if it's too transparent and it's just going to fall into the crevices, it's not going to do what I'm here to try to do. So yeah, that's probably good. If it's not enough, I can add more later. Yes, this is a rule sheet that I had to print out something for Carcassonne one time, and I think I had to do it more than once, so I just kept it to test washes on. Want a fairly decent sized brush for this. I find in general for washes and glazes, if you use the largest brush you feel comfortable with, it's often easier. This may be a little too thin. Yeah, I think it is. All right, so, well, by thin, I mean too transparent. In this context. So that is one of the confusions that we have in our hobby. We talk about thinning stuff down, and dilution in terms of I want to make this transparent, and dilution in terms of I want to make this runnier. Those are really two different properties, and it's helpful to know which one you're going for. So I want to have like a little more control than I would with an all over wash, but I don't have to be super precise. And then here's the trick. If I'm concerned that there's going to be a line, I just rinse out my brush. That's just damp water now. And I go along the edge of that line. So I'm essentially thinning the paint even a little more on the figure. And it's still a little bit wet. So that paint is still going to spread out some and thin down and not make a harsh transition line. But then down here, I'm not worried about it so much because, you know, the crevice is really down there, and there would be a little more of a line there. All right, where else do we need some shading? Yeah, down here. It goes towards the ground. Down here. So anywhere where it curves down is where I'm thinking about putting this. I did say under his throat. And then also the edges of the, you know, where the cylinder of his body is curving down towards the ground. And I can do that same thing. Take my brush, thin down the water. That time I was just getting a bubble. I wasn't trying to get a line. And then right here definitely needs a lot. In fact, I probably should have put some of that. I think some of those are actually the belly scales, so I should have painted it with the dark color. But I can maybe address that later. And that from a contest point of view, that is something to look at. Like, did you get all the parts? You know, if you were here last week, I missed that there was some base in the middle of the tail curve. And I had to get that on the fly. And then on this opposite side, it also curves down. Now, when I'm talking about cylinders, we got a lot of cylinders on the human body. So this applies to arms. It applies to legs, depending on the orientation. So this is a useful thing to think about when we're talking about shapes. This is more of a circle than a cylinder, but again, it's like if you think of this as a sphere, the light is going to be hitting here, and then where it curves down is going to be darker. Spheres are things like the head. Shoulder pads are, you know, half of a sphere. I mean, the round kind of shoulder pad's not, his shoulder pad is not a sphere. So I do see a little bit of line. I'm going to do that trick where I got my brush temp. And that area is still damp, so I'm going to add a little more paint, but the damp water should diffuse the edges of that paint a little. Acrylic paint isn't quite like watercolor, but it will diffuse a little bit if there is wet paint near it, which is why, you know, now that I have this wash on, I don't want to fix the base right now because the color of my wash may go into my base, or the color that I paint on the base may go into my wash. So that is going to need a minute to dry. So it's not quite where my example was yet. And that's because I actually did 2 steps of this supplemental targeted wash thing. So I did it with this ruddy leather, and then I did it again with down walnut brown, which is the color that's on the shield here. It's on the belly scales. But that is going to take a sec to dry. And I do want it to be dry before I proceed to the next part. Let me just see if there was anything else I said in this section. So for scales, if you look at it, there's a little bit of, you know, fuzziness due to dry brushing. If I'm painting a contest miniature, I could try to go back and smooth that a little bit. Maybe I take my original orange, and maybe I don't. So one of the interesting things is a lot of times the techniques that you would use scale. So you can paint something with, like, you made a cloak with just 3 colors, and layering, and maybe you see the transitions, but from, 3 feet away, it looks great, and that's good enough for the table. You want it to look a little better, maybe you use 5 steps of your colors. You want it to look really good, maybe you're using 9 or 11 steps. So you see what I mean about it scales. Feathers and scales don't scale. Scales don't scale as much. So it's kind of like there's the quick way, there's the slightly less quick way, and there's the I am painting every scale by hand and I am lining every scale by hand way, which would be like, Super Top, Golden Demon, Crystal Brush, back when they had that kind of contest level, is something that someone might do that for. There are some, you could use airbrushing and then do lining. There are ways that you could do other stuff, but in terms of like, is there a version of dry brushing where I'm taking advantage of this texture that it could make it look better? Yes, damp brushing. That's what we did on the metal last week. Is there a version of damp brushing that looks better? Not really. It's painting things by hand. Painting each individual little scale. Which I'm not saying that, you couldn't get gold without doing that. But I'm saying that is the kind of thing that some of the people who are getting gold medals and winning bests in shows and really fancy awards, that sometimes it's insanity is the technique. It's extreme patience and insanity. Did I kill enough time for him to be dry? I think I did. So let's get the walnut. Although, you know what? Maybe I will switch to the blue line. I'll switch to blue liner. So on the original guys, I used walnut, because that kind of went with the rest of what I was doing, and was, one fewer color that people had to have prepared for the class. But we were talking about unifying things, color schemes and whatnot, so I'm going to use, not gloss sealer, I'm going to use a different color, which is blue. That's a little more of the brush on sealer medium type thing, but I'm also adding straight water. Now this is a very dark color. I may need to thin it down a little more than I thinned down the Ready Brown. Let's have a test on my Carcassonne rule sheet. Yeah, that's a little opaque still, so let's add some more water. Can always come back and add more paint the way I did with the Ready Leather. Because this is going to be a little trickier. If you were just starting to try this, do something that's a little more in the color family. It's more likely to work and you're more likely to feel comfortable with it. Green Ghost says, I've got the insanity part sorted out. Now I just need to apply it to my painting. Applying it to your painting is being insane enough to do things the really slow, long way, I think. I guess sometimes our sculpt choices are insanity too. Is he in focus? Can he be more in focus? So I'm starting a little further down. If I need to bring it up, I will bring it up. And then if I need to, I can do that same thing I talked about of doing the thing. And I'm not sure if I did add just a little too much water. So I'll put another drop in. I do like to be cautious. Instead of finding out I did it the other way on the figure, although I would probably have just got a wet brush and wiped it off, had that been the case. So this is kind of extreme shadow. So I'm not going to add any here. This is a subtle shadow. There's just a slight dip. This is a big, curve under. This is not getting much sun at all. This could still be getting a little bit of light. I will do the damp brush just because I want to have like a bit nicer of a transition, not make it super obvious. Because we're going to get a kind of interesting effect here where the blue is blending with the red, so I am essentially making a purple. And purple is, in fact, if you're wondering a color to try doing this kind of thing with and you're not sure what to use, purple is, generally speaking, a very safe choice. It works on skin, it works on green, it works on blue, it works on red. Purple is just a magically cooperative color. I can do it down here a little bit, but try to keep it, you know, lower down than what I did with the Ready Brown. Ready Leather? Ready Leather. Ready Brown was a color and it's not a color anymore, so I shouldn't mention that one. That was one of the ones that got canceled from the HD line, I believe. But I think Anne said that that new brown oxide is kind of Ready Brown but better. So we do not have to mourn too much. We have Ready Brown but better now. Sorry, I was getting a little dry now. I'm seeing a few places where I'm going back to the Ready Leather. I didn't really, you know, paint the hands as nicely as I should have originally. Or some of the other bits. So we'll just come back and add a little bit of shading here and there. So hopefully you can see how just that simple, that did not take me a very long time, and it has added more of a sense of the shape of the figure than what we have on the original. Now I'm seeing a little bit of a line there, that you see how the blue does get kind of powerful. I'm just going to come back with the muddy leather, and that should soften the transition a little. But also remember that I'm turning it to look like that. If you think about what it looks like at the angle you're supposed to see it, and that's a very important thing to do when you're painting, because you have to move stuff around to get places, and then you'll look at things, you go, oh my gosh, look at the lines, look at how stark this looks, look at how dark those shadows are. You got to remind yourself to, okay, let me look at it in the orientation that the viewer is going to be seeing it. What does it look like there? That is the important question. Because you will find, especially if you're trying to push your contrast or play with colors or in other ways, you know, expand your skill set, you will find that your brain tries to make you do what you've always done. Your brain is used to seeing your figures the way you've always painted them. So if you're trying to improve them, your brain is sometimes going to fight you and say, oh no, it's too much. It looks too much. Take it up, take it back, take it off. And it's especially likely to do that when you look at things from weird angles. Because from weird angles, if you turn my stuff over, you can see transition lines or weirdness or whatever. I don't think it'll work on this guy that much, but let's have a try. Let's see if we see anything that looks... Yeah, look at how kind of patchy the highlight looks on his legs from this angle. And how you can see, you know, a sharper transition here and here. That's not the angle you're meant to look at him at. If I turn him back this way, I think that the legs look fine. And that one, maybe I could have smoothed it a little more. But overall, since the shapes, you know, where the things are light and dark match the shapes, it doesn't look as weird. So if you get the opportunity to look at the figures of someone who's teaching you a class at Reapercon that you admire. You're going down Artist Row, or you have a friend that you hang out with at the game store and you like their figures a lot more than yours. Do that. Look at them from other angles and see what it looks like. And you'll see that it's not perfect and pretty from every angle, because the focus of the painter has been on making it look good from the angle you're supposed to look at it. All right, I'm going to put messy washes outside of the painting area. And let's look at what's next. So I'm not going to do anything with the highlights because it is what it is. That was it scales. That's the technique we had. It's good enough. But these scales I do want to address. So on this guy, I just used the same dry brushing technique that I used on the other scales. If we look at the ones that I painted for the Reaper Virtual Expo class, you can see that it's a bit of a different approach. And I think that I like that approach. Now this one it's interesting. So I put the brighter colors in it. I didn't put the brighter colors in the other one. I think actually I kind of like the brighter color. I was not wanting to make the belly scales steal too much focus, I guess. Steal too much attention. But I'm not sure that it did. So I might be changing my mind. I was going to paint them a bit more neutral browns, kind of similar colors to how I painted this guy's armor, the tan, but not as light. So a darker version of that. But now I'm torn. Now I don't know what I want to do. So I repainted that the walnut brown. It's kind of the darkest brown on this figure. And now I have to make some choices about going up. So why don't we? Why don't we just say that he would have similar colors all over him? So I'll start with the ready leather. And I'm going to put all my paints out for this. When you're trying to paint texture, some of what you do is the opposite of what you do when you're trying to paint layers, and you don't want people to see the lines in between. So I need the jumps between my colors to be dramatic enough that you can see the little lines when I paint them. This also means that transparent colors aren't the greatest for this as a rule. I'm going to use my Saffron Sunset anyway and see how that goes, and if it doesn't work, I will figure something else out. Well, am I? No, I'm not going to use my Saffron Sunset. So the reason I say that is I put these out on my palette, and that Saffron Sunset is part of what makes these scales pop. That bright yellowy orange. And I don't want the belly scales to pop as much. I don't want them to draw as much attention, and I don't want it to look too samey. So if I leave out or shift a color a little bit in a thing like that, I can get it where it still looks like this is what the color brown this creature scales come in, and but still have some variation between them. So I'm going to take my Numeneria Rust was the starting point orange color for that, for people who weren't here earlier. And then I'm going to take non-metallic gold highlight and mix what is hopefully a little more subdued of a version, but also a little more opaque of a version of Saffron Sunset. So people who get upset about all their paints not being opaque straight out of the bottle, there is a value to paints that are more transparent and paints that are more opaque. And I'm not really sure if I love that. What did I do on it? Who knows? And I'm going to make one more transition of that. I go straight to that yellow. That's going to be too much. And I'll show you my palette again, which I am not trying to hide the colors that I'm using or hide how I grab those colors off of the palette. It's just if I put the palette in frame, the camera is going to say, oh, look at those colors. I just want to look at that and not that figure that you're holding. And in the end, what did I do? Something like that. So it's more orangey instead of yellowy, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it's not even different. Who knows? We'll see what happens. That's why I'm here, to experiment and screw things up, to hopefully give you guys ways to avoid experimenting and screwing things up. So, for brush, ideally this is a sable hair brush technique. Not even because, you know, of being super precise, because I'm addressing these scales from the point of view of a more, you know, tabletop accessible, you don't have to have mad skills to do this technique approach. But that little hook that's on the end of a, sorry, I'm looking for a particular size of brush. That little hook that's on the end of a synthetic brush is not a helper when you're trying to paint a straight line. It is not. So I can experiment with a few, with the synthetic brush, because I know that's, you know, if you have the Learn to Paint kits, or depending on what you normally paint, that's what you have. But this is one of those things where it's worth having a fine tip brush. So this is like the Reaper 20, which is like mad crazy. This is the kind of brush that I use to paint the little, so it's little crisscross lines on Lars's armor, which I have no idea if you can see it on here. Let's see if we can see it on the back a little better. So I used probably this exact brush to paint those. I might have had another brush that was similar. But that, we're not looking at that kind of level of precision for what we're trying to do here. So you'll get nice fine lines with that, and you may find it easier to work with. I'm not one of those people who is judgmental if you prefer working with smaller brushes. I think it's good to practice to use the largest brush you can handle, because you'll paint faster often. But I don't think it's like the only way. But this is the Reaper 50. So I'm just trying to figure out the best way to hold this and also so that you can see it. So really, I am just making downward strokes. You know, I'm painting a lot of tiny little lines. I'm not making sure that every one of those lines is 100% perfect. I'm just making sure that I've got my brush orientated so that as I pull, I'm pulling down. If I need to, I'll move the figure. And then the other thing I want to think about is, again, where is the sun? You know, where is the light falling on this guy? So as we start getting in these scales that roll under, I'm not going to go up to all my colors. And I'm going to, you know, on this scale, there'd be more light here than there's going to be here. So I don't know if you can see. I think you can see some of those little lines. You can see where it's wet at least. So this is the darkest color that I'm doing with these lines. And I will jump in with some of the other colors just so you can see where it's going. So I hope you see what I mean about it. It doesn't have to be fancy and precise. It's really, if you can, you want to do the control of, you know, I don't want to go all the way down this scale with this next lighter color. And I don't want to go as far up here with the next lighter color. But in terms of brush control, that's about it. This is a, you know, if you want to practice brush control, this is a decent way to do it. It's not, oh, see, now I'm not sure I've been in frame. I will do some of that again. So I've done the, I'll do some of the darkest color on this one. Be able to see it. Now this is not an ideal motion for me going to the side. I normally would not do that if I were painting. I would paint like this, but I wanted to make sure you can see it because his head's going to start being in the way now. And it's okay if I have to go over a section multiple times with that same color. Sometimes you'll need to do that to actually see the texture. So here's the second lightest color. Orientate this. Yeah, wants to focus on his head instead of down here. But hopefully you can see the, I'm going to turn it sideways again, which again is not. Always try to keep your brush kind of making the same motion, and it builds up your brush control a lot faster. It's like in sports where they talk about muscle memory because you're just doing the same motion over and over again. It's the same thing with a paintbrush. So that's pretty good, but I think we do need to go up just a little lighter. Now this I need to be careful with. The color I mixed has some white in it. So I know that it could be pretty opaque, and it is. So see how much more that is standing out. That is non-optimal. So I'm going to add in a little more of my orange. And I could also thin it down a bit. By which I mean make it less transparent. Where's my problem that I didn't go to my middle one? I did my middle one. Let's double check. Double check I did my middle color. Hey Modular Realms and Raiders, Fancy Unicorn. Hope you're having a good day. I'm working on this Nagendra Swordsman, Snake Man guy. And what I've done is I painted this one, and I'm painting this one as if it were a slightly better version. So things I would do to improve this figure a little bit. And one of those things is instead of just dry brushing these scales, yeah, I missed my middle color is what happened before. I might come in and do something like this, which you're going over and over and over a section, so it's not like you have to have super precise brush control. So then if I felt like that was too dramatic a jump, I can come back in with my orange color and come over it and tone it down a little. But you want to see it. I mean, you want to see that it's a different texture than those other scales. As I was saying just before the raid, this is a technique that it benefits you to have a sable hair brush because it has a finer point and it won't get that little hook on the end. You know, let's see if we can find one that has a little hook on the end, as I'm sure most of my synthetic brushes do because I get the little hook almost immediately. So that little hook on the end there. So this isn't me having something against synthetic brushes. I just think that there are functions that some brushes are better for than others. And it's going to be hard to paint a straight line if your brush is starting out curved. So I'm using a brush that keeps a straight point because I'm trying to paint straight lines. And that is why it is worth having such a brush, even if you are not someone who wants to, you know, spend ages and loads of time painting miniature and so on. You're trying to get stuff on the table. Because a lot of these texture techniques are faster than trying to do nice smooth blends, or even than sometimes in dry brushing, and they look cool. So texture is not something just for the fancy painter people. I'm trying to find what I did with that smaller synthetic because I could try a few lines. We'll see how it goes. I'll do some down here where it's not as obvious. So what I need to try to do is be aware of where that curve is and orientate the brush. So I'm kind of using the corner of the curve to make the little lines. Also, if you have a fresh synthetic brush, that'll work too. So let me get the next color up. I mean, really, it's not as bad as I had feared it would be. So this is an accessible technique, I promise. It may seem scary. I don't know that I want to go nuts with this lightest color down here because, as we were talking about, if I have him in the correct orientation and we assume the sun's coming down on him, there's not going to be a lot of light hitting down here. So we're not going to see things that look as light as they do, say, hitting up here. So I'm just working on that side of the scales that are starting to curve down instead of the whole edge. Which is what I'm doing up on these ones. Come back with that middle orange if I feel like, you know, it's not going high enough up or something. You can work back and forth with this. Textures are very forgiving for working back and forth. So, while the result with that brush isn't as horrible as I thought, I'm not enjoying the experience of painting with that brush. So I'm going back to my sable. And this is not actually, you know, a super high-end sable. This is the brush you can get in the Reaper store, which is like a good... Oops. See, now that looks too stark right there because I didn't do the original starting color. So even though the original starting color is not a huge, you know, it's not a strong value difference between the brown, the darkest brown that's on there, the walnut brown, you kind of need it to start the foundation of the texture. Now these scales are head on, but they're also closer to the important part. They're closer to the face of the figure. So I may cheat and put a little more light on them than I would down here. You know, this is not, the story of the figure is not where the tail bends down like that. The story of the figure is his determined little face and how much he wants to kill you. So if I want to draw attention, I want to draw attention there. And then also, if I were painting this for tabletop, that means that I'm saving time because I'm not painting parts people can't see much anyway. So a lot of the stuff that you know, display painters and people who paint the web models and contest painters, a lot of the stuff we do applies to tabletop. It's just figuring out, you know, how to apply it and save time instead of spending time. But most of the things that make a figure look good make any figure look better, not just a fancy one. So I am going to come in along the edges a bit with that lighter color, partly just so we can see that there are edges there. These plates are a lot smaller. I'm not able to get, you know, fully detailed lines and stuff because they're closer together. And here I'm concentrating, so talking about the form, the shape, I'm concentrating the lighter bits in the center because it curves away. So it's a cylinder like this, his belly scales, and some of them are curving away to the sides, so it's going to be lighter here and more shadow here. This one's not as curvy. I think they're mostly, you know, curved around his chest to create the shape of his torso. If I think something isn't as bright, I can come back in again and add a little more. Not being afraid to go back and forth is something that would be very helpful to you if you do want to enter contests. So this is dark down here. If this were a tabletop mini, I would not bother painting this because, like I said, people aren't going to see it. Since we're saying this is a contest miniature, something you're going to spend a little more time on, I'm going to come in. I'm not going to add all the colors, but I'm adding the texture with that, you know, the second darkest color, just so that if you go like that, it doesn't look weird. And I might actually add just a little bit with the orange in a few places because it does still look weird. It looks too different from what's up there. But that's just so, you know, if a judge picks it up and they go like this, which we do, it's going to look, you know, that the texture underneath is going to match. All right, so that's the belly scales. That was not a horrible trial, I don't think. I do question whether I want just a little lighter in some of the spots. I've got a mix. I mean, you can't even hardly tell that it's lighter. Just adding a few points here and there. All right, I think that basically works with his color scheme. His gear is still really fading in, and that's because there's just a flat coat of color on that. I haven't got to addressing that part yet. So let's see, that was the belly scales. You can do that streak highlighting thing on weapons too. And I'm not sure why I got rid of that. We'll need it back, but let's get Lars back out. If you look at his weapon, especially kind of around here, or maybe from the sides, you see it looks a little streaky, and that's because I was basically applying the paint in a very similar way. I just did it with slightly closer together transitions so that the lines weren't as obvious. Because I wanted it to, if you look at reflections in metal, you'll see streaks where it's a little darker or a little lighter. So I was kind of going for that. All right, so now we're on to the metal areas, except that is not true. We are on to the straps because I think you have to paint those before the metal areas on this figure. Yep, because of this thing. All right, jumping ahead. Well, actually, let's, I need to do something on the base, so I'm going to start that now so that paint can dry while we do the straps. So for people who weren't here in the beginning, I was talking about how the color scheme on this original version is solid, but it's not, there's stuff you could do that's pretty simple that would make it even more effective. In this case, the something you could do is to work with that orange. So if it has this green base and you have orange, that's a color triad on your color wheel, which is very handy for all of us to have one of these. And you can look stuff up online too if you don't want to run out and buy one. So if we look at his main color is orange, and I talk about a triad on the color wheel, it's got these shapes, these triangles, but if you do an online one, it'll usually have a button where you can just click triad and it'll show you the colors. So in this case, green is one of the colors in that scheme, and then purple is the third one. There's no purple on this guy, so I could have used some purple in the shading, used a purple wash instead of a black wash for the metallics, used a purple wash on the grass even. The additional color doesn't have to be present in a really visible way to see it. Could have done purple brown belly scales or leather. But in this case, I just want to do a simple color complement where the color complement of orange is blue. So I'm adding some blue accents to the figure. And one of the ones I want to add is to make his armor kind of a dull blue black instead of, or I mean, maybe it's just a blue. I don't know if we'll keep it as dark. We didn't keep the other armor as dark, so I might not keep this armor as dark. I'm going to use, I'm missing one. Midnight. So this is a triad. This part is a triad. Midnight blue, twilight blue, and snow shadow. That's a triad that Reaper sells that I love for, you know, faded blue or mix it with gray a little and do non-metallic metal. I had got out this ashen brown and I don't think it fits, so I'm going to get rid of that. Just mix if I have to. So on this guy, we did simple tans and I just did a couple layers. I may do like one more layer than I had done on the other guy, because we are saying this is a contest miniature, and doing, you know, a few more steps, taking a little more time, that is one of the things you do with a contest miniature. This snow shadow is a very pretty color. It might be too light, but this is, I've talked before about tinting strength, how some colors are really powerful. So like if you mix black with something, you don't need a lot of black to make it darker. Typically if you mix white with something, you don't need a lot of white to make it lighter. But this snow shadow is a very weak color, and I will show you what I mean just as a demonstration. So I'm going to mix this, but it's going to be tricky to mix because it is such a weak color. Because I don't know if I want to go that light. I want it to be a little less light than that. I'm going to mix it with the twilight blue. But let's see what I could do for an example. So I'll get the ashen blue back, because even though it's not as light, it doesn't have as much white. We didn't make the drop quite the same size. Let's look at mixing that in to the twilight blue and see the effect that each of them has. So let's it's roughly the same size. And this is just how color works. This is one of those things that I know frustrates people who start painting and they don't, start miniature painting and they don't know a lot about color. And they're like, why does this one behave so much different than that one? Well, that actually worked better than I expected. Let's see here. So the Twilight Blue had a stronger effect. Those are now roughly the same value, even though the Snow Shadow started out being a lighter color. But I'm not going to use that Twilight Blue because that's too much blue. I want blue, but just a little hint of blue. Soupçon of blue. So I will, in fact, add more Twilight to my third stage. Now these straps should stand out a little more because we're using Hue Contrast instead of Light Contrast. So this is, there is Hue Contrast. It's like a yellow brown instead of an orange brown. But it's still brown versus brown versus brown. So now we're going to have blue versus brown versus brown. And that is helpful. To being able to see things better. Sorry, I have a particular brush that I'm looking for, and I'm struggling to find it. Well, I just had this brush too. Alright, so I've painted them a very dark color, in this case blue liner, which I like even better than black. So it fits in with I'm using blues, but also it's actually kind of darker than black, and it has a good flow, so it's easy to paint details with it. So I painted all the details. I didn't go over the metal, like the shield and the sword blade, but I painted all these metals prior to the show starting with the blue liner. And that is, I was essentially doing lining. I want to leave those dark edges. So I'm using the side of my brush. Let me get a bigger brush for people who haven't seen this before. You can use your brush to, dry brushing is one way that we use our brush to use the texture of the figure to apply the paint, but it's not the only one. So if you apply your brush kind of crossways to texture, like this, I draw this along. There's no way I'm going to accidentally paint the side of this because these things are parallel, or perpendicular, not parallel. So I'm doing the same thing with these straps, just with a slightly smaller brush. I'm painting across the top of the straps. I'm not trying to get into the sides. That's why I painted everything with that dark color initially, so that I didn't have to worry about getting down in the sides. So this will make like an overall cleaner look, as well as making my life a little easier. There may be places where just the texture doesn't work that way, or you have to use the point of the brush instead of the side of the brush. But overall, that side of the brush trick can be very helpful to painting some details. And I didn't do it there, but I probably should have. And I'm just going to stay on the back for a minute and go up to the next color up. Right now, I'm just trying to cover up some spots where I see orange because I probably should have applied 2 coats of that blue liner, and I didn't. There is just a little bit of, this part is leather, not a metal strap, so I'll get that while we're on this side. So now I'm going to go up to the next color up. And I'm not trying to be fancy. I'm trying to use similar techniques to the ones that I painted the other figure with. These are, so the reason this show is called Beyond the Kit, for anyone who's new, is I write the Learn to Paint kits, the current generation of Learn to Paint kits for Reaper miniatures. So there's one kit called Core Skills, which talks about doing washes and dry brushing, and another kit called Layer Up, which talks about doing layering and glazing. So for the most part, I am just using skills that are covered in those kits. I don't always, sometimes I'll do other stuff on the show, but I called it Beyond the Kit because it was a nice opportunity to start talking about, there's only so much space in a little booklet, and this show gives me opportunity to talk about some things there wasn't space for. So it's starting to look a little more blue, and even though it's actually kind of dark compared to this tan color, you can see that it still stands out because we've got the hue contrast. We've got complementary colors. We've got one that's cool, we've got one that's warm. So there's different kinds of contrast. Value is a super important one, and that's the one we talk about for shadows and highlights, doing washes, dry brushing, going up higher in our shadow or in our highlights and lower in our shadows. But other types of contrast can make that more effective, or we can use it in places where we just can't use value contrast for some reason, or we can use them together. We can make something lighter and cooler, or lighter and warmer than the surrounding area, and that gives it even more contrast. So just adding a little bit of highlight. I'm not going to add any highlights under there because that part is facing down. I'm the sun. I can't get under there. It doesn't need highlights. But now let's adjust the leather on this side of the figure. Oh, and I'm not sure that I did paint over this section with the blue liner, but we'll just cover it up with this twilight blue. And I actually meant to repaint that. So I'm going to have to get my blue liner, get a bit of blue liner out, because I knew that I would be painting those belly scales, so I didn't paint that part beforehand because I would have just painted over it. But I do need to put that dark color in there. So you can see how currently the belt kind of fades in with the scales because they're pretty much the same color. The belly scales. So I want to fix that up a little. And while I'm here, I can get a few other spots I missed. And this is the nice thing about acrylic paint. Like, I know people you get stressed out when you make mistakes, and it's upsetting and you don't want to make mistakes, but acrylic paint covers over itself really well. It dries quickly, then you just put some more paint on, you fix the problem, and you go on with your life. So a lot of the people you admire, it's not that we're not making mistakes. We make so many mistakes. But we're willing to just take a deep breath and go, okay, now I put some more paint on and I fix it. It's still a little wet here, but I'm going to pretend I didn't notice that. Always get stressed out making you guys watch paint dry. Oh, and he has a bracer on this arm as well, which I was almost going to forget. So I'm a little bit torn on whether to make the shield straps the same color. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to, but I think if I were to make them that tan color instead, that would not be introducing like a ton of extra colors and stuff. It would be fine. But for the sake of speed and color harmony, I'm going to just go with the blue on that. So now I'm adding the lighter, I'm going up like 3 steps. So I have a fairly dark blue. Show the palette again. So that was my starting one, and now I'm on to this one. I do not keep the palette in frame because the camera likes to focus on the palette instead of the miniature when I do that. I wish I could show both things at the same time. One day I may figure it out. But for now, I do this. And here again, I'm thinking about the sun. So the sun's going to put highlights here. It is not going to put highlights here. So I'm not going to add any more to the blue down there. Now there are little laces that do up his bracer. I'm not getting overly into detailing that. If you were doing a contest entry and you do have the brush skills and the patience to do that, that is a good thing to do. But if you're starting to work your way up and you don't do that, that's okay too. When I'm talking about contest entries, if we still have some new people with us, so Reaper Miniatures has a convention on Labor Day weekend, and we have a painting contest called the MSP Open. And this is a fun painting contest because you are competing against yourself. So it's not only like the 3 best people are going to know how they did or win anything. All the pieces are assessed, and you can enter actually multiple things. So say you entered both of these snake men, and the judges would decide which one they think shows off your abilities to best advantage. We'll say it was this one, and we judge this, and it's awarded a certificate, bronze, silver, or gold medal, depending on the standard that it meets. So if you, like, we're kind of saying, what would be the best possible version of this figure? How close is this one to that best possible version? So then by competing against yourself, what I mean is next year you might come and you got a certificate, and then you're trying to get a bronze. So I've been, painted this figure, and then I'm talking about how would you make it a little better with this version, with kind of the feedback that you would get at that contest in mind. But this is also the same kind of feedback you might get if you post a figure in a Facebook group or on a forum, or you take a painting class and you ask the teacher for feedback. So I'm just trying to give an example of what it looks like to make the changes that people talk about, because very rarely do you go home and you want to paint over your figure that's finished and you're happy with it. So I like to try to give visual examples like this because some of us aren't great at visualizing, like myself, for example. So I did this last year in the lead up to ReaperCon. So if you go to my website and look for, I think it's critique, like a critique, it should be in bold, critique overview article. There are links to previous figures that I've done this with, where I've come back in and said, okay, here's the critique it would get, and here's what it would look like if you did what the person said in the critique. So there's already existing versions of this to look at if you like the idea. And then I just have some other figures where, I actually have done that on occasion where I've gone to a contest and then I come back and 3 months later I go, oh yeah, now I see everything that's wrong with this figure, and I try to fix some of it. So we could go a little lighter maybe in spots, but I said I was trying to make it similar to how I painted the other one, so I don't want to go too crazy with that. So we'll call it good. So now let's get our original recipe against New Crispy here. So you can see how even though the blue leather isn't a lot lighter than the tan leather. In fact, it's slightly darker than the tan leather. I think we can test that in a minute. But it still stands out pretty well because of the hue contrast. So contrast between the colors, and then contrast between the temperatures of the colors as well. Let's see, we have a question. Green users. In a diorama with one figure that is more tightly sculpted than the other, how much paint plastic surgery would you do? As much as I thought was necessary to tell the story. So in the diorama category at ReaperCon, story is like a big element. So if it were the secondary figure, maybe I don't want it to stand out too much. So I would probably just do enough to make it look as good as I could with paint, but I might put more effort into the other figure if it's the primary figure. I definitely want to make sure that I put my effort and I think about my contrast things towards whatever, if there's an interaction between those two figures, which is likely if it's a diorama and telling a story, where they interact is where I'm going to want to put strong value contrast, strong hue contrast to draw attention to things. But, in the case, it's a secondary figure. Like, I think a few years ago, David Diamondstone did that figure where it was like a Dr. Frankenstein type of character who was trying to bring somebody back to life. Now, I'm not saying that there was any issue in the sculpting of his figures. I'm just using that story as an example because it came to mind. If the Dr. Frankenstein figure is probably what I would consider to be the primary character in that story. So if the sculpting wasn't perfect in the Frankenstein's monster character, I don't know that we'd pay a huge amount of attention to that. To be fair, though, I do typically judge the painter category most often. Diorama is probably one I would feel comfortable with too, but I do not feel that I'm qualified to judge open because I don't know enough about sculpting. And I definitely am not strongly qualified to judge ordnance, although I have done it in the past because weirdly, some of the breakdown of criteria that we're looking at is actually very similar to painters, but you do need to know. It is advantageous to know about kits and vehicles and that kind of stuff, because some of the things that they do are very demanding skills that I just don't know enough about to know that. So we try whenever possible. At the points when I was doing it, it's because there wasn't enough judge people to do ordnance. And over the years, we have remedied that there are people who paint those kinds of things and are knowledgeable and informed about them. But yeah, for diorama, paint and construction and stuff, those are definitely components, but that's the big difference between that and open, I would say, is that story is also a component. So stories points are going towards story. So if you're hitting that and some of the sculpting isn't amazing, that's not going to be as much of a problem as if that's a figure in open where we're looking at both the sculpting and the painting. And this is so another article that I have, and it's through that, you can find it through that critique one that I was mentioning, is I think it's called MSP Open Frequently Asked Questions or something like that, because there were some questions that came up when we give people feedback after the contest, and one of them was kind of like, it looks like this bronze in open, the painting isn't as good as this bronze in painters. And it might not have been, because painting is 30% of the kind of criteria that we're looking at in open, and it's 70% of what we're looking at in painter. So overall, the skill level to get a bronze, silver, gold in painter is going to be more demanding than the skill level in open, because the open people are also like doing heavy conversions or scratch sculpting their stuff. So they're being assessed on two skill sets and being given credit for the fact that those are both very different skill sets. And I guess there's a little bit of that in diorama too, because telling a story is a skill as well. It is one that I, for example, am fairly terrible at. Kerniko is saying that diorama is beautiful, which it was. It was very moving. I liked it too. So, green users, did that answer your question? Because if it didn't, let me know and I will clarify. All right, so what did I say I was doing? I was going to paint the stone before we got to the thing. So, since I didn't go the green, orange, purple route, this painting this as grass, in my opinion, does not contribute and may slightly detract from the overall thing. This is a somewhat saturated color. It's actually toned down a little now. Well, it doesn't stick out as much now that we have the blue, because we've got another color with a bit of saturation on it instead of more brown. But I still feel like it doesn't contribute to the characterization or story of this figure. We can still think about story and characterization on single entries, just things that are just one character that doesn't, even if it doesn't have a fancy base. So I could go with like a sand type of thing if I wanted it to look deserty, which would fit the character pretty well. But I think stone works too, so I'm just going to go with a basic stone. As I try to do when I paint, when I, need extra colors, because I'm not doing a specific thing, I try to use colors that are from the Learn to Paint kits that it's possible that viewers will have. So I'm using Mountain Stone, which I do like. as well. It's a nice, so it's not a pure neutral gray. It's a gray with a little bit of brown in it. And if you look at nature, there really isn't anything that's true black, true white, or true gray, the way a neutral color would be. And let me see if I have a neutral gray so that you can see what I mean. And I may not, because that's not in the kit. But I do have gray primer. So I will show gray primer. Oh, I tell a lie, because rainy gray is actually a neutral gray. Or we can just mix white and black. That's how you get neutral gray. You mix white and black. So this is, you know, pure white and pure black are the colors in the Reaper lines that really are like, this is just black pigment, this is just white pigment. Some of the other blacks, you know, are a little bit warm or a little bit cool. So that watery stuff that came out, that's the binder part of paint. I did not shake this one before the show, as I usually do. So if I just keep squeezing, I'll get some black, but it's not going to be very thick. You don't have to put this back in the bottle. I just figure, why not? Like, if you lose a little bit of binder, it's not going to ruin your paint, is what I'm trying to say. But that will be watery. So if you get paint and it comes out watery like that, it's going to look semi-transparent. It's going to be watery because the pigment is not mixed up in with that binder. And that's what it's supposed to look like. I do advise people shake their paints more than you see me do here. So I will add some of the mountain stone here. And then I will try to mix a color that is like the same value of gray, the same darkness, lightness of gray, but I'm mixing it with pure white and pure black. So it will be a true neutral gray. So there's a true neutral gray, and I think it's too shiny, so I'm going to get a piece of card and apply them to a piece of card. It'll be easier to see. So this one is a true neutral, and this one is a gray with just a little brown. I mean, if you look at it on its own, you might not even think that it has that much difference. But if you look at it side by side, color's always relative. Sometimes you have to look at other colors to see a color better. You can see that there's a little something going on in that one, and that little something going on, to my mind, is more natural, because if you look at stones, they will have brown and green and other colors that kind of weave through them. So if I start off with a color that's got some of that going on, I'm helping myself out. And that's the kind of thing that when I was talking about my current blog entry talks about neutral colors, that is the sort of thing that I'm talking about, is seeing the color, how to see that is this a little bit of brown, is it a little bit of green, is it a little bit of blue. You could have a gray with any one of those things going on. So how do you see it? And then how do you use those variations to make, you know, use, when I talked about orange and green and purple or a color scheme, and you're like, okay, but I don't want my thief to be wearing, you know, bright orange and green and purple, then he'll look like a jester. It's like, okay, but you can have browns and grays that are kind of green and kind of orange and kind of purple, and you're still using what the color wheel told you to do. And so it's going to look more harmonious than you just picking random browns off of your shelf. Hey, Thousand Young. So I'm going to let that dry while I work on the, what did I say was brown? The metal. So I'm going to start the same way that I did with the other figure, which is with Blade Steel. That's another color from Learn to Pink It. And also just a general steel color that I like. I think I will. So I don't always remember to do this, but when I can, I like to swap out, you know, to another. See, I wrote on it even metals, and I have my own sponge that says M for metals. I like to swap out so that I don't get little sparkly bits when I'm trying to paint something, you know, I want to paint flat black, and then but I've painted steel recently, and that doesn't go well for me. So that is something you can do if you have similar problems. But I don't always remember to do it when I'm on camera because I'm trying to keep things moving and keep it interesting. I'm applying the metallic over a dark color. You will find that most metallic does apply better over a dark color. In this case, it's a dark brown. I could have painted it a dark blue. That would work well since I'm talking about blues. You know, using blues for shading the metallics. But I'm going to do a wash, so I didn't bother changing it from how I had painted the figure originally. But you will find that you probably need fewer coats of a metallic to get it to a nice shiny state if you start with a darker color underneath. And it doesn't have to be as dark as this. But that walnut brown was a significant color in the colors I was painting, so I went ahead and went with that. There is a lot of commentary sometimes about don't use your nicest brushes with metallics. I go back and forth on whether I think it makes that much difference. We do a lot of stuff in miniature painting that is tough on brushes. But if you have like an older set of detail brushes that you've replaced with something newer, but they're still, you know, viable to use for at least some tasks, those are nice to use for metallics if you can. But I don't think like touching some metallic with your fine sable brush is going to immediately render that brush inoperable. In fact, I'm pretty confident it doesn't because I do it all the time. In this case, I'm using the same brush that I used to paint those belly scales, the little streaks. If I wanted to take more time, I probably would have gone back over those details with the blue liner to make sure that I had the edges nice and dark so that I'm building in my lining. Because some of the leather was, you know, it's under the plates, so I might have got my lighter blues around the edges of the plates, if not on the plates, because I'm actually kind of a messy painter. But I think it looks good enough, so I'm not doing that. I did wipe out one of the lines between the plates. I can come back and put that in later. So there are a few little detail areas. He's got one more plate here. Then there's like, I think the buckle on the end is metal. I decided to make the thing that you put the end of the strap into the loop. I'm sure that's another one of those things that there is a term for that I do not know the term for. And then this circle here holding the straps around his chest is also metal. And the sword hilt, of course. And the shield. I am probably going to have to do a second layer, at least on these big areas. Well, we might be able to get away with it. Because of what we're going to do, we're going to get away with it. Metallic paint is a little goopier than regular matte paints. So where I don't like get super stressed out about filling in detail unless it's very, very fine. Reaper rarely does this to us. I have painted miniatures for other people that do sometimes give us super fine detail that I have to stress about filling in. Just fixing some of the lining that I ruined. So if you can do fewer coats of metallic, because he's got these runes inscribed in the sword, I don't want to do more coats if I don't have to. Because I'm going to highlight it, it should be fine. Oh, I do want my precision brush just for one more part. Hey, EJO. So I'm trying to paint and I'm using that perpendicular thing again. I'm trying to paint just this edge as if it were metallic, because that is how I painted the other Nagendra. Yes, if you would like to get this figure, he comes in a 2-pack with another, with this buddy, I think. So these are the Nagendra swordsmen. And then if you need more snake people to torment your players with, there are 2 other packs. There's like a leader pack where one of them's like a wizard or a sorcerer or shaman or something like that, whichever thing you want to call it. Magic using person of some stripe. And then like a commander. And I can't remember what the other 2 are doing offhand. And they have more gear, so they have like fancier torso equipment and stuff, because they are the leaders. Oh, did I miss the edge just a little? So I'm trying to be quick so it's less boring for you guys, but I do want to take enough time to check for bubbles. When you try to paint really fast, especially if you're painting a textured surface, like these little scales, and oh, see, look what I did. So there, I got metallic on there. I'm not freaking out. Getting my eraser brush, and I'm going to scrub that off. And if it doesn't work, I'm just going to paint over it with pink. The main problem is going to be that I think I will be able to scrub this off, but there's going to probably be little sparkly sparkles here and there that I might have to paint over. See? No panic. All fixed. This is an old, well, I think this was an angle brush, but if you have an old flat brush that, isn't nice enough to, I mean, this one is still nice enough for dry brushing, but when you get one that's not nice enough for dry brushing, you just cut the bristles off a little shorter, and you will have your very own eraser brush that comes in handy, like that. Because acrylic paint does touch dry really quickly, but it doesn't really cure as fast as we think. Like if you want your mini to be as sturdy as possible, paint it a few days before your game, give it at least 24 hours, and better 48 hours for the paint to fully cure before you handle it a lot. Likewise with sealer, because the kinds of sealer that we use are essentially clear acrylic paint, so it dries in a similar way, cures in a similar way, and in a similar time frame. And then if you have miniatures that you prime, likewise, if you let your primer sit for a little bit, it starts getting sturdier. So a lot of my tips about painting sturdier miniatures, which I do have an article on that if you're interested. It's how to paint a miniature that will survive the apocalypse, or at least a minor fall. And I think there are 7 or 8 tips, and sealer is only one of them, and in reality, I hardly ever seal my miniatures. And this is a bones miniature, so if I were painting this for a game, I still wouldn't seal it, because I find that classic bones is very sturdy. But metal and resin, if I were using those in a game, I would use a gloss sealer and then a matte sealer, because the paint doesn't adhere quite as well. All right, so while that is drying, I'm going to do a quick wash on the stones on the base, and I am just going to go out on a limb and use my blue liner wash, partly because I still have it, but partly because I probably really would do this. Use blue in the shadows of various things because I'm trying to get the color harmony working. And when I go over it again with the dry brushing, the blue's going to fade back, so it's just in the shadows. At least this is my hope. I do paint more often with the layering technique, and this works well with that. Sometimes things that work, you know, shadow colors and whatnot that work with layering do not always work with dry brushing and washing. So I may discover that I am incorrect, but we'll find out. I'm also going to apply the same thing to the sword and the shield, because those I do want to have a touch of blue and have it be noticeable even. But I think it might need just a little bit more water. Because that has been sitting here for a few minutes because I did that. I used that color a minute ago. And it's not on a wet palette, so I'm going to have to check its consistency. I think the metallic is dry. Super scientific testing there. That could have gone wrong for me. And I think this is similar opacity to the black wash that I did last week on the other figure. But now that we know about targeted washes, I can just do some of that if I have places that aren't dark enough. Or places that aren't blue enough. I might find there are some places on the shield that I want to have a little more blue to accent that, you know, semicircle curve that I was talking about. That's maybe a little bit too much wash on the brush. Then I feel like I want an even bigger brush, but I'm not going to bother. I get a lot of wash on this. I am going to have to check for bubbles again. And then the part that I forgot about from last week, where if you want a wash to fall into the texture fairly evenly, sometimes you have to hold it in a particular orientation to make that best happen. And the shield is definitely an example of that. And I will show you what I mean in case you weren't here last week in just a minute. After I get some wash on all the bits. Probably gonna have to clean up that edge, but that's fine. Alright, so I'm going to put some extra on, so it's going to be very obvious. I'm just trying to get bubbles out. Blowing sometimes works. All right, so if you look at that, it is fairly evenly distributed. You know, there's about as much wash in that crevice as there is in this crevice. So to you, this looks like you are looking at him from head on. For me, because the camera's actually from above, he's tilted over to his side. So if I start tilting him, gravity is going to draw that wash downwards. So if I want all of those little crevices to be equally shaded, I'm going to need to hold him, what to my orientation is sideways, but to you it does not look sideways. Now, there is a reason I might not want that to happen, but we'll say that I do. So you can use something like putty or kind of lean it up against something. So I'm just going to lean him up against something, and we'll look at the photos and talk about if there are any remaining issues with this figure that I haven't addressed. And also, I think we had an audience question. He's rolling away. Hold on. He does not. His brother didn't want to do this either. So Degreeny2 was asking if that's a blue glaze. In this case, it's actually a wash because I was applying it very liberally with the intention that it fall into crevices and accent sculpted texture. When I do a glaze, it's a similar consistency, maybe even more transparent, but I'm applying it in a very targeted way so that it is only going where I want it. And I'm trying to figure out if I have something I can demonstrate that on, but these are all... Here, I'll try it on the base of this guy. The problem with these bones is that thin down paint that's had water added to it won't stick to it until you've got a coat of paint on it. So if I'm doing it as a wash, I want a ton of paint on my brush. It's like a bunch is going to come off, and that the gravity is going to make it fall down in the textures. If I'm using the same thing as a glaze, if I have a lot of paint on my brush like this, I'm going to take something, I use a sponge, paper towel works too. I'm getting the excess paint off so that I could paint a straight line with this, and I'm applying a single coat of kind of the same thickness of paint over it. So I'm tinting the entire surface the same way. So you can see that didn't even make much of a difference because that's how a glaze works for me. And in this particular case, we're just making this orange a little darker. So I would go back and apply more if I wanted it. Or, maybe that color, I would add a little more blue to that color if it wasn't having as dramatic of an effect as I wanted. So that's kind of a very basic example of the difference between a wash and a glaze. The paint isn't the difference as much as the way you apply the paint. Hey, Daffod Weir. All right, so I'm going to go just a little bit over today, but I think I want to try to finish this guy up. All right, let's go back to the photos for a minute. If that's okay with you, Wendy, if you've got somewhere to be, I can totally finish up now. Let's see. So what else did I not talk about? Him that I wrote down. Let's see. We'll look at the front view for a minute. I guess I never really talked about the metallic. I talked about how the base, the green color doesn't really fit with anything. So it either needs to be more neutral or it needs to be part of the color scheme. And that's why I was repainting the base to be a stone color. And the metal areas, so the wash worked, it brought out all the texture details, or most of the texture details. We were talking about how this being an original bones, that's a little... there are areas where the detail didn't get captured as well as we might like. And one of those areas is the runes on the sword. So the detail on the shield came through really well, but the runes on the swords aren't as crisp as they could be. So if I was painting this as a contest entry and I had my druthers, I would get a metal copy of it, which I believe exists. But given those parameters, the way the wash worked and the way the side brushing worked for the metal and the highlighting, it worked fine. What I could do is the same thing that we talked about with the form, the shapes of the figure, how there should be more shadow under the part that would be his butt if he were a person. There should be more shadow where the cylinders of the tail curve down towards the ground. If you look at that shield, it is a slight curve. It's a bit of a semicircle. So where it goes down towards the ground more, there should be areas that are a little darker. And then there should be more highlights on the areas that are curving upwards towards the light. I'm assuming a sun from above lighting scenario with this figure. That is the typical one that we do. I did do a couple of episodes where I did OSL, source lighting, and those are archived on Reaper's YouTube channel. Do I know the numbers offhand? No, I do not. But you just look for a girl holding a shield, holding a torch, and there are two. I think it took me 2 episodes to get it mostly painted. There's at least one, but I'm pretty sure I did 2. So then this was also one of the areas where the color choice is neutral. It doesn't detract, it doesn't add. So if I'm using an orange blue complementary color scheme, I bring some dull blues into the metallic shading. That makes it look like blued steel. It plays with the orange. It adds a little something. So that's why I was using the blue liner as the wash on this example compared to the other one. And once it dries, which I can tell that it is not dry yet, we will compare the two. I mean, I do have a little bit extra painting to do because we did some highlighting on the metal on this guy that we're looking at in photographs. So we should do the same thing with the improved version. Okay, that's a different figure. We'll talk about that just for a sec because I'm still looking at paint that's not dry. So this is the figure of the month at Reaper. This is a Bones USA figure. It's Lars Ragnarsson. So you can just go buy one, or if you buy like $40 US or equivalent currency off the Reaper web store, they throw this guy in for free. And there is the back of him. And if I keep going, I get back to my snake guy. So I wrote down the critique comments for the snake. So I'm just checking my paper to see if I missed anything. Nope, I think I got everything. So again, if you find this interesting, hearing kind of the critique that you would get at a contest like the MSP Open, if you go. Now, not every contest has the personnel and setup to do critiques afterwards, but you might also get critiques from pictures you posted online, from if there are a lot of people whose Patreons, they offer a level where they give critique. If you take a class, you'll get critiques. So what I'm trying to do here is show you some examples of what it looks like to put some of those critiques into action so that we can kind of compare a before and after. And is it going to be like a startling, oh my gosh, this is so different change? Maybe not, but the kind of incremental things that you do are how you eventually get from, here to there, I guess I would say. The base is dry, so even though the shield is still not dry, you can tell from the shininess. I will do the dry brushing on the base. Well, I think my mountain stone looks fine still. Running out of places to put all my napkins and things. All right. This is a very small area, so, and I'm really almost doing side brushing more because I just don't want to hit the parts I already painted, basically. So if you're looking at it, I don't think it looks like super obviously blue in the shadows. But even though viewers may not detect that like on a conscious level, and you might not want them to because you might not be... Oh, I got more silver on that part of the tail. Let's see if the eraser brush still works. Because there does come a point where the eraser brush won't work anymore. But let's give it a shot. Because I painted the scales last week, I'm not that worried about rubbing off the actual paint. If this orange paint were fresh, I might hesitate to get too scrubby. So I think I'll just have to repaint that part. My apologies if you hear a buzzing. The spam people always call me when we're doing the show. There's that inconvenient little part where you have to decide, do you want to paint that before you paint the scales, or do you want to paint the scales before you want to paint that? And that there's almost always something like that on a figure. Which I'm just mentioning because one of the most common questions I get from people who are starting to learn to paint or have been painting a very long time or don't feel very comfortable with their painting, might be another way of putting that, is what order to paint things in. And kind of from the inside out is a good general guideline when you're talking about, people type characters, especially because you got your clothes and then you've got your skin, and then over that is your clothes, and then over that is like your armor or your accessories. So you kind of go in that way. But in general, it's just thinking about what's going to be, what am I less likely to mess up if I paint it later? You know, like if I paint this later, am I more or less likely to mess it up? Is really what the equation is. And sometimes there isn't a great answer to that. It's just there are going to be some parts where it just takes a little more effort to hold still or not mess it up or whatever. So I've got a slightly lighter gray. I am mixing in a neutral gray, but because the thing I'm mixing it into isn't a neutral gray, it's not gonna have a bad effect, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Do I still have my neutral gray mixes? We'll see in a sec if I get it up later to match that other color, and I can show you what I mean about neutral gray versus non-neutral gray. Actually, I had a paper that I was painting on, so I'll just paint each of these new mixes onto the paper. So that is not wildly lighter than my original color. So this is the color that I painted the stones. This is what a neutral gray of similar value would look like. But now let's make my second highlight for the stones in even lighter color. Oops. Trying to drop my paints. Which is 100% something that I do. Alright, I have my mixing brush. So you can see that even though I'm using rainy gray or something to mix these lighter highlights in there, but because I'm starting with something that's not neutral, it's not going to make it too neutral. And if stuff that I'm talking about with neutrals doesn't make sense, go look at my current blog post, because it's all about neutrals and how to have cooler neutrals or warmer neutrals or colorful neutrals. But basically, if you don't enjoy painting black, brown, or gray, go look at my latest blog post. And I will have many tips for you. So this is the base. It's not the center of attraction, so we're just gonna leave it at that. That wash still has some drying to do, but we can, even though this is the frame and we usually do it at the end, we can paint the base frame right now because I'm not painting anything else down in this area of the figure. And I'm just going to use basic black for that because this we do want to be neutral. We want it to not really, it's a frame, it's not the art. So it's okay if this part is neutral. Now, as I was saying to people who were here last week, I did used to kind of customize my base rims. So for this figure, I probably would have used either the blue liner or the walnut, the super dark brown, to make the, because you can get colored frames too. If you have artwork and you want to get a frame that, you know, has a touch of red or whatever in it, you can get those. You can get mattes that are colored too. The reason I stopped doing that mainly is just a practical one, that the base rim is the area most likely to get chipped and damaged, and if I've painted some funky custom color on there, then that's harder to fix. Where if I just painted black on everything, then I know what color is on the base rim. So it just kind of finishes it up, which is, I mean, sometimes we get contest entries where people have not done that. Or if, say this base, he didn't come with this base, but I had put it on there and I'd used gravel and I'd used gray gravel. You still want to paint it the way I just did it because it makes it look in scale with the rest of what's on the figure. So not painting the base is another fairly common issue that we see with figures. Like not painting base materials and textures is what I mean by that. Where are we? I think if I start on the sword, that will hopefully be dry by the time I am done. So I'm getting fresh blade steel, which was my starting metallic color, because I find that metallics just go weird on a wet palette pretty quickly. They probably go weird on a dry palette pretty quickly too. They dry faster or they gum up faster or something. They are they do have some different properties to standard paints. So that is not totally weird. I'm not doing dry brushing exactly. This is side brushing. I'm using the side of the brush against the sword blade. So nothing's going to go down in those crevices the same way as dry brushing, but I get a little more control. So I'm like wiping the paint off of this brush. So you get this, there's a big goop of paint on there. I'm wiping it off until it's a controllable amount of paint, but I'm not scrubbing it off like a dry brush. I want the paint to be on there. I just don't want so much paint to be on there that it's going to fall, get into any of those crevices where the details are. And it got a little bit in that one because that detail is very shallow. I can take my blue wash and fix that if I need to. Do the same thing on this side. And this is exactly how I painted the sword on the other figure. Then along the top here, I'm going to use that same sideways thing. I may need to get more of a detail brush for this part. Or a slightly smaller brush. But see how it's kind of flattened out? So you get that. If I'm trying to make my brush pointier, I'm spinning it when I'm getting the excess paint off. If I'm trying to make it flatter, I'm like pressing it and then turning it over and pressing it again until it's got sharp edge there and flat there. In this case, I'm going to use the sharp edge to go in between these teeth so that I don't have to go get another brush. And then I'm going to use the flat edge to go on top. I'm going to go this direction to minimize the chance of going in between where I want to keep more of that shading. So there are more ways to use the texture that the sculptors have very kindly provided us than just dry brushing. There are other ways to manipulate your brush to use those. I am going to switch to a smaller brush because some of these details are quite small. But I may keep doing the same thing where I'm using the side of the brush. So I don't want to have, color go accidentally on the leather part. So I'm just kind of pulling it up towards where I want it. So let's see if we can zoom way in. We look at these belt loops as an example. I'm going to start about halfway up and then pull the brush up, just the side, using the side of the side tip, I guess is what I call it sometimes. And do something similar here. So when looking at these shoulder blades, or it's scale armor, so it's scales of metal. It's not his scales, but it curves again. So zoom back out a little bit. It curves. So I want to get a bright part here and then let the shadow fade off to either side. So I'm not going to put the full strength metallic paint on the whole thing. I'm going to kind of concentrate it where I want it to look shiniest. So it looks like the light is reflecting off of it. These are kind of the same principles of application you would use for painting non-metallic metal. It works just as well. You use matte paints for the shadows, and then you use metallic paints for the midtones and highlights. And you get to control, you get to have some say over where is this thing looking the shiniest. Which is part of the reason why my photograph wasn't too horrible to take. Those photographs I was showing you earlier, because photographing metallics can be one of the most annoying things about metallics. So a lot of the people you see that are painting kind of fancy level stuff, we're not necessarily doing it because we hate metallics, we're doing it because we hate photographing metallics. I think I wiped out a little bit of my shadow here, so I'm just going to come back. And then just put a few little accents on the hilt. Checking to see if I missed anything. I did miss, he's got little rivets holding the straps on. I'm not going to do the one that's under that arm because it should be so shadowed that you don't really see it, and also that way I don't have to reach it. So let's see. This is finally done, so I can get my bigger brush back. I might need to get more metallic though. And I'm using that side, the side of the brush thing again, to try to avoid filling in all the, you know, that nice detail that the wash brought out. It's going to get a little trickier in some places on this shield. So I need to try to, you know, not get the tip of the brush in those crevices along here. And I did a little bit of this last time, I think, where I talked about how because we've got that curve, I'm not going to do a similar thing there, but the light would hit these edges. So I'm adding highlighting to those edges. And it might hit some of these edges as well. Or little places where, you know how, if you stop and look at metal things and see places where the light really looks like it's, you get those hot spots and that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to do here. Now, I'll show, hold on, I do need more paint. I'll show you how I would do those rivets. So what I would do is kind of ignore that there are rivets for now. And just work on making this rim how I want it. So I wouldn't worry that I was getting paint over areas with the little rivets. And that has that edge too. And then probably get a little bit on the side here where there would be more reflection. And then we will return to the rivets later. But I also did a stage of highlighting here. I used this True Silver. Thank you, Real Abby Normal. I'm trying to help people see just little things you can do if you want to try to give your figures a little more oomph, or you want to try to enter the contest online, or like the MSP Open. Reaper has online contests too, though. So this is a highlight color now, and I'm going to want to apply it a little more judiciously. In fact, to that end, perhaps I should use my smaller brush with a finer point, so I have some control over it. You can, if you're worried about transition lines, and you will get transition lines doing this kind of thing with metallics. They won't always be like super obvious to see. It'll sometimes be you turn something in a direction and you're like, oh, there's the line. But if you're worried about it, you can thin down the metallic paint, but then use, I brought some, but I don't know if I'm actually going to do it. So it's brush on sealer is good to use with the matte colors, but if you're trying to make metallics more transparent, you might want to use the gloss sealer so that you don't lose the sparkly. And using those mediums, those are essentially a medium, the binder part of acrylic paint, keeps your metallic flakes in suspension. So if you just add water to metallic, the little flakes are going to start falling down towards the bottom of your pool of paint, and you might not be picking all of them up and getting as many as you wanted when you're painting. So if you use those things, they stay in suspension longer. I definitely want to use this brighter color on those places I was saying, or at least some of those edges that I was talking about being hot spots. And it is a highlight, so you need it to be in a smaller area than the previous layer of paint. And it will too nuts with that because we're already over time. And here I'm going to make some decisions on the sword as well. I'll do a little bit of that side brushing, but I might want to have more control about where I'm putting these lighter colors. If I really wanted to get fancy, I could go lighter still, but we didn't do that on the other guy, so I don't think I'll do it on this guy for a fair comparison. I'm not putting any of this lighter color on this side of the blade, because if you're looking at it and the sun's coming from here, that whole plane of blade is facing down. It's going to be having some reflection off the light that's bouncing up from the ground, but not a lot, so don't add too many more highlights is my motto. And also saves me work. So not everything fancy painters do is a maddening thing meant to take more time. Sometimes we're saving time. I feel like that didn't have enough of the starting metallic color, shall we? Definitely want to put a little bit of the super shiny on the little bits, because that helps them stand out and be easier for people to see. Especially important if you're doing non-metallic metal with this metallic. The different sheen of the paint is helping me. It's a kind of contrast, so it's making things stand out. If you're doing non-metallic metal, you have to use, pretty bright highlights on the little bits to make sure that they stand out. So how I would do the rivets, I would come back with my darkest color, not very thin down, and paint the whole rivet. And I won't do all of them, I'll just do them until some of the ones I'm doing are dry. Then I get my metallic and kind of doing that brush flattening thing again, and just touch the top. Just touch and lift. Touch down, lift up. And you should be able to use the little part of there is a little part of the sculpt that is poking up, that is that rivet, and that will pull the paint off the brush, and then I can probably avoid getting stuff on around that black line. So that is how I do lining on little tiny things like rivets. I do not try to paint the rivet and then paint the lining around it, because that way my madness lies. I will need to paint all of these to do a before and after picture within them. So right there, I don't think there actually is a rivet. I think it might have gotten lost in the mold making process. And that is where we do the paint plastic surgery. That's a little harder though, so you could also just ignore that and say that rivet fell out. It's just a hole now. That is reasonable too. I'm not sure I think it's blue enough, but let's compare it with the original one. In fact, we'll take him off the thing even. So he doesn't have eyeballs yet, and the other guy does, because I didn't want to give away that I was choosing the blue option. So I will fix his eyes later. All right, so this is the original one that I painted that I've been critiquing. And this is the revised one, which is really just the only really different technique is I used, little lines, which is not super precise for the belly scales, instead of just dry brushing those. And I switched a couple of things to blue. But overall, I think he's kind of a more cohesive, slightly more attractive figure. So the little touches of blue, we look at the shields, that is probably going to show it the most. It's not like, no one's going to look at this on its own and go, oh my gosh, it's so blue, that metal looks stupid. But you can see that just that little hint of blue, which, I mean, blue steel is a thing, just looks a little richer than the straight black wash. And then he's got the shading to bring out the form of the cylinder that is a snake's body, as well as the scales. So I used a wash over everything to bring out the texture of the scales, and then I applied additional washes just in targeted areas to create the shape of his body. So you look in between the shoulder blade. Well, that's not the shoulder blades, but down in the the spine going down towards his waist. You can see more definition on this one than this one because I put it there. I didn't rely on the wash to do all the work. The wash is going to bring out the texture. The wash is not necessarily going to bring out the shapes, the overall forms of the figure. So the fact that he has little tiny scales is important, but the fact that his body is a coiled up cylinder is more important. So we need to show that before we get into the detail of the little scales. Because let's zoom out. And we're looking at him, we're on the shelf walking by at the contest, or we're looking at him on the game table. And you can see the shapes of this one, and you can see the gear and so on a little better. You cannot see that I painted the belly scales a different way than on this guy. But when you're painting a contest entry, and people who only do display type painting tend to make this mistake, very much myself included, it's not just about what you see close up. This view matters. You have to grab people's attention at this view and then make them want to look closer. So as we get closer, we'll start seeing some of those details come out a little more. So the form's still there. The fact that, the butt area curves under is still apparent. But we're starting to see, there's that texture there. There's more individual scales here than I saw at first. And that will keep on going. Now, out of curiosity, I'm going to do the black and white thing. So everybody prepare to get a little psychedelic with it for a minute, because this camera has a whole bunch of settings I have to go through before I get to black and white. So this figure, it may not make that much difference. The things that I've done may not make that much difference in the black and white view. So this is important because this is where you see your value thing. So you can still see his belts and straps, probably even a little better than this one because these are slightly lighter. But that form thing is still showing in black and white because that was adding darkness. So the fact that you can see where his spine indents and you can't see where his spine indents, that's from adding lightness and darkness. But the fact that I used a dark blue wash on this shield and the fact that I used a dark black wash on the shield, you're not going to see that without color. So value and color are both types of contrast, and they both function to add attractive elements to our figures in different ways. And ideally, you want a figure that works in black and white, but looks even cooler in color. So hopefully that made sense as here's what I would do differently thing. I think the base looks a lot better on this guy. I like that better, even though I tried to pick a green that wasn't too, mind-blowing. But hopefully that makes sense. It gives you some information about how you would start applying critique or some of the stuff that people say to do to improve your miniatures. I will try to do another, repaint or edit or critique or something, at least one more before ReaperCon. If there's anything else, ReaperCon or MSP Open related that people would need to talk about and you don't feel comfortable saying it in the chat, so you can just say it in the chat if you want. But if you don't feel comfortable saying it in the chat, send me a private message here or on Reaper forums or on my artist Facebook page. There's a lot of ways to get in touch with me, and I understand if you feel shy and you don't want to talk in the chat. I know we have lurkers. I usually lurk a lot of places too, so I totally get it. But I do want to try to talk about, the MSP Open and ReaperCon stuff specifically, but also general improvement type stuff, because you don't have to be coming to ReaperCon or entering a particular contest to care about that. But I'm going to let Queenie find us a raid now and let you all go. You're welcome, Kiriniko. I hope Vitulari Fidesen, first of all, I apologize for probably butchering your username, said, I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm glad that you did. And if you want to see more of these for the people, I don't think well, I think I mentioned this after the Raiders, but just in case, if you go on my website, which the bot has just shared a link with, it's the birdwithabrush.com, and scroll down there a bit and look for something about critique. And that's kind of a master table of contents to all the stuff that I have related to critique, because I've done these previously on the show. And also just on my own work, I actually do that sometimes where I go back and check. I don't always do it, but every now and then I go back and I was like, well, this sucked, let me fix it. So I have a lot of before and after things that you can kind of see, oh, this is what more contrast looks like. Oh, this is what it looks like if you do lining, stuff like that. So I don't know if I interrupted Quindy putting the raid on, but I will just hammer enough for the raid to get going now. And say goodbye to everyone, and I'll see you next Monday. Hope you have a good day.